Welcome back. This scenario that we're going to look at is what we call as a SOAP to RFC scenario. What does this mean? We are going to expose an interface in PI such that it becomes a web service. So any web service client like SOAP UI can make the call to PI, and in ECC this interface is then going to make a call to ECC, and like we did in the previous exercise where we did a call to ECC using an IDOC, in this case we are going to do a call with to make a call to an RFC or a remote function call. Okay. The difference between the scenarios that we've executed so far, this first scenario that we executed was a file-to-file scenario. The second scenario that we've executed is a file-to-IDOC scenario. And the difference between the first two scenarios and the third scenario here is that the first two scenarios were asynchronous interfaces. And by asynchronous interfaces, what we mean is they were fire and forget interfaces. Now, the SOAP to RFC scenario is a synchronous interface. And by synchronous interface, what we mean is there's a call that is made to PI, and PI is going to respond back with a response. Okay. So with that information, let's get started. The first thing that we would need to look at is what is the backend RFC that we are calling. If you remember, in the file to IDOC scenario, we called a standard SAP IDOC orders.orders05. Similarly, in this case, we are going to call a standard SAP RFC called BAPI user get detail. What does this BAPI do? This BAPI takes the user ID as an input. It executes a check whether the user exists in the system or not. If the user exists, it returns the details about the user. If the user does not exist, it will return an error that says user does not exist. It will return an info message, not an error message, that the user does not exist. Okay. So let's first, before we do anything on PI, let's just execute this BAPI standalone and see what happens. So I'm in transaction SE37 in my ECC system. I'm in transaction SE37. I'm going to transaction SE37. I'm executing BAPI. I'm searching for the function module BAPI user get detail, and I'm saying execute F8. Okay. Now it's going to ask me for my user. So I'm going to say user PI15, which is my user, and execute. And I get the details of the user. Okay. Now let's make it a user PI AA. Let's make a dummy user. You'll get the message that the user does not exist. You don't find anything around the user's first name, last name, and so on. So if I execute again, you see you're getting more details around user, what is the company he works for, what was his last modified date, and so on. Okay, so this is a standard SAP function module that we are now going to expose via PI as a web service. And how do we do that, right? The first step that you would be doing is in your ESR, you will be importing the remote function call. If you remember, in the file to IDOC scenario, we had imported the IDOC. Now similarly, we will be importing the RFC. The next thing that you will be doing is you will define a service interface for your SOAP. You do not define any data type and any message type. Any reasons why? We will look at that. Basically, the idea is you want to expose, the RFC has a set of input parameters and a set of output parameters. So let's go back, display. Instead of execute, I'm going to display. So the RFC has a set of import parameters. The import parameter is a username, and it has a certain set of export parameters, and it has a set of tables, right? So the idea is when we are exposing an RFC as a remote function, as a web service, I do not want to define any custom structure in PI. The requirement is whatever is the RFC's request becomes the request for the SOAP, and whatever is the RFC's response becomes the response for the SOAP. So that's why we do not define any custom data types and message type. We in fact use the data type, message type of the RFC within our service interface for the SOAP, and we will see how we use that. Okay. There is not going to be any mapping. It's going to be a pass-through interface. Why is there no mapping? Because the request structure and the response structure are the same. There's not going to be any mapping at all. Actually, we will do a mapping. We'll do a straight 1:1 mapping just to make life easy. So we'll do a mapping, and for consistency's sake, we will execute a mapping. And after we do the mapping, we will configure a sender SOAP adapter, a receiver RFC adapter, and configure the interface. And after the interface is configured, we will take what we call as a WSDL, and we will test that WSDL in SOAP UI. Okay, so let's get started. Don't worry, we will be looking at this in detail. So I'm going to close all here, and now I'm going to go ahead and define my namespace. Right click, new namespace, make sure you're in namespace and give the name of your namespace, trading.com/file. Sorry, this is a SOAP to RFC scenario _ 00. Okay, and then give a description, namespace for SOAP to RFC scenario, and save your namespace. Okay, so the namespace is now being created. Now that our namespace has been defined, let's go ahead and import our object. So what are we going to do? The first step is going to be, we are going to import the RFC in our PI ESR. So right click, import of SAP objects, provide the application server details. So I'm going to get my IP address from my ECC server. System number is 28. I'm going to give my password. I say continue. Previously we had imported the IDOC, now we are going to import an RFC, so expand on RFC, and like it had happened for the IDOC, loading of the RFCs is going to take some time, so be patient. Like I mentioned when we were talking about the IDOCs, because the speed at which all the IDOCs get loaded or all the RFCs get loaded depends upon the number of objects in your backend, and a standard ECC backend contains thousands and thousands of IDOCs and RFCs, which means the loading takes time. It also depends on your network bandwidth, so please do not do an alt tab of your screen, especially when you're a beginner in PI. It is going to take at least a lot of time. In some cases it can even take 5 minutes. Please be patient like I am. Don't do any alt tabs and just hold on while the RFC is loaded. Whenever the list of RFCs are loaded, we will resume. Till then, let's just wait for the RFCs to get loaded. My RFCs are loaded. So now I'm going to type BAPI _ user _ get _ detail and search for this one. And I got my BAPI user get detail, right? Now select the RFC. It's going to say yes, it's ready for import, and say finish. Again, the import will take some time. Please be patient. Let's wait for the import to get completed. The import was successful and the import is completed. So let's go ahead, go to our change list, and let's activate our objects. Make sure you're not in the edit mode. So excellent. What do we see here? We are seeing a namespace definition. We are seeing the BAPI. What is this? FU _ BAPI user get detail. This is nothing but the documentation of your BAPI. So just go to your change list and right click and activate all of them collectively. Okay. So now my change list is activated, and now we are ready with the next step. What was the next step? Define a service interface for the SOAP scenario, right? So let's see how do we do that. So I'm going to my namespace, right click, new, select interface object, select service interface, and give the name of your service interface. SIO, yes. Why did we say yes here? It's an outbound synchronous interface. Remember, as we just discussed, this scenario is a synchronous scenario where you're going to make a request and get a response, and that's why even the naming convention reflects that. Instead of calling OA, where outbound A used to stand for asynchronous, in this case S stands for synchronous. So we call it SOAP to RFC and say 00. Okay, all right. So the category is outbound. The mode is asynchronous. Default is asynchronous. So let's switch it to synchronous. And what do you think happens? Look at it here. Now you have a request structure and a response. Basically, PI now says, hey, now that you've defined the service interface as a synchronous service interface, you need to tell me what the request structure has to look like and what the response structure has to look like. And now, if you look at this drop down, you have multiple options. Message type, external message, IDOC, and RFC. So far, we would always use a message type where we would have defined a custom data type and a custom message type and use that in our service interface. But in this case, what are we going to do? We are going to take the structure of our RFC. I'm going to drag the RFC here and do it this here. So my request is going to be my RFC request. So I select that, and excellent. You see, now the type has changed to RFC message and the request is out here. Let's go ahead and for the response also drag this and select the response. Remember, now it's the response that you're doing. So select the response, and here you see excellent. This is the request, this is the response. What is a fault? If you're from a web services background, you would know that each web service also provides something that is called as a fault message. At this point, we're not going to go into the details, but fault messages are used for exception handling in web services world. So in case there's an exception, you can use a fault message. Equivalent to a fault messages in an RFC or in a function module, typically in SAP you would define an exception. So an exception is equivalent to what we call as a web service fault as well. Okay, so in this case we're not going to do any kind of exception mapping. We are just mapping we've defined a service interface. The service interface is outbound, the service interface is synchronous, and we selected the RFC request, BAPI user get detail. This is the request message. We then dragged again the RFC and we used it as our response message. And with that, the service interface has been defined. Okay, the next step is to define the message mapping. So let's go ahead. Oops, something's wrong with my mouse. Okay, let's go ahead and say new. Let's go to mapping objects, select message mapping. So SOAP to RFC. And now the question is, how many mappings are we going to define? Let's look at that. We are going to define SOAP to RFC request mapping. Okay, what does request mapping look like? Let's see that. Okay, so what is my source structure going to be? My source is going to be the BAPI request, and my target is also going to be my BAPI request. Okay, excellent. Now what I'm going to do, instead of having to map each field manually, just make sure you select the root node and click on this field. Click on this field, map selected fields and structure are identical. All target will be lost, yes. Excellent, everything's been auto mapped, right? If you press this button, everything would get auto mapped. So you've defined one message mapping where you're mapping the SOAP request or the RFC BAPI request to the BAPI. And now you're going to define one more message mapping, and this is going to be a response mapping. Where now you're going to map the BAPI's response back to the response. Okay, so the source message is my BAPI response. The target message is also my BAPI response. And here I select both of them and I say map identical fields. I click on apply. I save my mapping and my response mapping is also done. The next step is to define a operation mapping, right? So make sure you right click, new, select operation mapping. Let's give the name of our operation mapping, and this is where it becomes tricky. We just need to define one operation mapping. We shall see why. So I'm going to drag my service interface here, outbound service interface out here, and once I've dragged my outbound service interface here, in the target service interface you need to take your RFC and drag it out here. Again, make sure you're in the black box and you're dragging this. Now let's keep a close eye here when I do read operations. Do you see what happened? PI was able to understand that this is a synchronous interface, and because it is a synchronous interface, PI is now saying, hey, what is the request mapping and what is the response mapping? So the request mapping was from BAPI user get detail to BAPI user get detail, which we just defined here, SOAP to RFC request mapping. So let's select that. And then in the response mapping, it is from the BAPI user get detail dot response to the BAPI user get detail dot response, right? So let's select that and we are done. Okay, so the request goes like this. If you see, PI, the SOAP adapter makes the call to PI, the mapping gets executed, it goes to the RFC returns the response, and now from the RFC's response, this will get mapping will get called and the response will go back to the SOAP service. Okay, so that's it. We are done with our ESR, where we have done couple of steps. We have imported an RFC, we have defined a service interface, and for the first time we've defined a service interface that is outbound and synchronous. And because it is synchronous, PI is now asking us for a request structure and a response structure, and we provided them with the request structure and the response structure, which is equivalent to the BAPI's request structure and the BAPI's response structure. Then we went ahead and defined two mappings, one request message mapping, where the request message of the BAPI gets mapped to the request message of the BAPI, and one response mapping where the BAPI of message mapping where the BAPI's response gets mapped to the BAPI's response. We did not define any data type and message type in this server. In this scenario, we only define one operation mapping. The reason we only define one operation mapping is once you select your synchronous service interface, PI automatically says, hey, because this is a synchronous interface, you need to provide me with a request mapping and a response mapping, and you just did that. Okay, with this changes done, let's go ahead and activate our changes. So right click on your change list, activate your changes. Excellent, the changes are activated, and now we will proceed to the configuration in the integration directory. Let's now go to the integration directory. As always, I'll close all my objects here. I'll now define a new folder. Right click on your folder, create, and call it SOAP to RFC 00. Okay. Now we're going to first create a sender communication channel, and this sender communication channel will be under training underscore file system, communication channel. We're going to create a communication channel. So right click, say new, make sure you're on communication channel, select training underscore file system, BS underscore file system underscore 00, that is your sender business system, CC underscore SOAP to RFC SOAP sender 00. That's the name of my communication channel. I select it. I select my adapter type as SOAP. Make sure it is SOAP. Say apply. Excellent. Make sure it is sender. Make sure that the quality of service is best effort. Every time you're doing a synchronous interface, the quality of service is best effort, and for an asynchronous interface, the quality of service is either exactly once or exactly once in order. We will look at this in detail, but for now, make sure that the quality of service is best effort. Best effort means that your message will get delivered in a synchronous fashion. Okay? And save your communication channel. The next communication channel we will be defining is a receiver RFC adapter, and because you're making a call to EH5, I'm selecting the communication component as EH5 client 800 CC SOAP to RFC, give the name as RFC underscore receiver underscore 00. So the idea here is your receiver system is ECC, so make sure your business system is pointing to, your receiver business system is pointing to EH5 client 800, which is my ECC business system, and make sure that you're creating an RFC receiver communication channel. Okay, in the adapter type, select RFC, say apply, make sure that the direction is receiver. Now you need to enter the details of your SAP system. Okay, it's asking me for my application server, so I'm getting my IP address. So get the application server. My system number is 28. My user ID is, I don't remember it, so let me go here, system status, and get my user ID, right? Yeah, this is my user ID. Oops. I will give my password. It's asking me for the language. It's EN for English. It's asking me for the client. My client is 800, and I'm done. So I basically provided the details of my RFC, what is my SAP system, what is the IP address, what is the SID, what is the system number, what is the username, what is the password, what is the logon client and the logon language and the logon client. So my sender SOAP adapter is defined and my RFC receiver adapter is defined. Let's go ahead and now define a sender agreement, right? So my sending system is BS file system 00. How do I define a sender agreement? Right click, new, collaboration agreement, make sure you're in sender agreement. Your sending system is BS file system 00 and your sender interface is SIOS SOAP to RFC 00. Okay, excellent. SOAP to RFC, it's outbound synchronous. So let's say create. And what is my sender communication channel? It's going to be a SOAP sender communication channel. Make sure you're selecting the SOAP sender channel and say apply and save it. Okay, now let's go ahead and create my next object, and the next object is a receiver determination object. Okay, so my sender interface is going to be again SIOS SOAP to RFC. That's the scenario that we are building. Select the sender interface details. And who's my receiver? My receiver is going to be EH5CLNT 800. Just make sure you've typed it correct by using the selection help and saying apply. Save your receiver determination object, and after you save your receiver determination object, go to configuration overview, navigate to your receiver, click on your interface. Your interface determination needs to be created. Right click, say new, specific. Now that you have created here, it's going to ask you for the operation mapping. Select your operation mapping, OM SOAP to RFC, and note here the receiver interface is now a BAPI. Okay, you did not create an inbound interface. Your BAPI, the imported object, automatically acts as your receiver interface. Save your interface determination, and now that your interface determination is saved, refresh. Okay, now that I've refreshed, select this, my interface determination is showing. Right click on the receiver agreement, say new specific, and when you say new specific, it's going to ask you for the receiver channel, and my receiver channel is CC SOAP to RFC, RFC receiver 00, because it's a RFC receiver adapter. Select it and save your receiver agreement. Go back to your receiver determination and refresh. And once you refresh, all the objects are created. Go ahead, change list, go to your change list, right click your change list and activate all your object. What were the object that got created? You created a sender communication channel of type SOAP sender. You created a receiver RFC adapter under EH5 client 800. You created your sender agreement, you created a receiver determination, you created an interface determination, and you created a receiver agreement. Save and activate your objects. And now that you're done, the next step is going to be a step that you're going to do for the first time. You're now going to go ahead and open your sender agreement object. So I'm going to go ahead, close all my objects. And once I close all my object, I'm going to go ahead, navigate to my sender agreement. This is my sender agreement. It's very easy. Just use your tooltip. It will tell you what type of object. Go to sender agreement. And once you go to sender agreement, open your sender agreement and go to the menu at the top, and you will see this option that says display WSDL. Go to your sender agreement and select this option, display WSDL, and excellent. And you will get a WSDL URL. Copy this WSDL URL into your notepad. We will be using this WSDL URL in SOAP UI. If needed, you can also copy this WSDL file and save it locally. So we'll also do that. Save the WSDL locally. So I'm going to save the WSDL also locally. So I'm going to call it SOAP to RFC _WSDL. Okay, so let's do this one more time. I'm going to cancel. I'm going to close everything. I'm opening my sender agreement, and once I go to in my sender agreement, go say display WSDL. When you say display WSDL, you will get two things. One is your WSDL URL, and that is this that we've copied into the notepad, and then you will actually see your entire WSDL here. Okay, so copy the WSDL and again put it into a notepad, and when you put it into a notepad, save it with an extension that is WSDL. Okay, and now open it with notepad. Don't open it with any other software. And this is my WSDL. Make sure there's no space at the top. Save it. Okay, now we will be using this, while we have shown you how to download the WSDL, what we will be doing is using this WSDL URL, downloading this message in a web service testing tool like SAP PI, and then testing this interface. Okay, so let's go ahead and launch SAP PI.